I am hosted today by Iurie a Moldovan politician and latterly Christian campaigner and host of the Chișinău Forum, which I, among others, participated in September. First of all, Iurie Roșca, thank you very much for having me here in your home in rural Moldova.
You are welcome, my friend Alex.
You were born in 1961, the year in which the Soviet Union launched Yuri Gagarin into space, and you were named after him.
Yeah, because it was a sort of miracle for the generation of my parents. That's why it was very useful for that generation to name the sons of Yuri like a false scent, yeah. Yeah.
Your mother was a school teacher, and your father an agronomist, and in the Soviet system, certainly in the Brezhnev era in which you grew up, both parents usually had to work. So this left you exposed quite a lot to the good influences of your grandmother, Alexandra. Would it be fair to say that it's through her influence that you became a Christian even during the Brezhnev era persecution?
Okay, in that period, usually our parents avoided direct religious education for ideological reasons. They were a little bit afraid for repressions, and that's why our grandparents were our teachers in catechization. Yeah, that's why. When I was a little child, and my brother and my sister, we didn't practice the same way of praying every single day, but we saw it. The example of Grandma Alexandra was very important, and she went every single Sunday on church, and it was the first period of my life when I discovered this way of living and thinking. And only after many, many years I remembered this period and became an active practitioner.
Your grandmother also introduced you to the pre-Soviet memory of your people. Historically, ethnically, you are the Romanian people. You also use the name Moldovan, of course, because before the Second World War, Moldova was entirely within the territory of Greater Romania. And back before that, historically, it was a medieval principality of Romanian language. Only later, from the end of the 18th century, did the Russians start encroaching first to the Dniester River. That plays a role later because Transnistria has become a pro-Russian separatist region of your country, against which you've campaigned hard in Parliament. Then later on in the 19th century, 1812, they moved further west to the Prut River, and that border between the Russian sphere, the Russian Empire, and Romania, the Ottoman Empire as it then was abolished for a time between the First and the Second World War.
Exactly.
And after that, the Red Army invaded and once again split your homeland, so that you find yourself in the independent republic now, post-Soviet republic of
a long
Moldova.
Soviet story, but not so long as for Russians was this tragedy. And our first teacher in anti-Soviet and anti-communist way of thinking and acting was my grandma, Alexandra. For her it was a personal tragedy because it was state terrorism and expropriation, and her husband was killed in 1946 by accident. It was very interesting, unusual story because my grandfather was a teacher in our village. His name was Jacob, Alexa. And in the territory of Bessarabia, Soviet Bessarabia.
And for the viewers, Bessarabia is that part of historic Moldova which is east of the river Prut. So
Exactly.
effectively the modern territory of the post-Soviet Republic of Moldova.
Partially because during Khrushchev era, our southern part was cut and northern part also was cut, and now is part of current Ukrainian state.
So when you talk about Bessarabia here in your grandparents' day in the Second World War, you're talking about that part of interwar Romania which the Red Army occupied.
Exactly, and terrorist groups of so-called Bandera movement, which operated in Ukrainian region, Lvov and other regions, they operated also in Bessarabia, and they usually killed Soviet communist activists and Red Army officers. And my grandfather was a strange person for that period because he was his clothes was like a very important boss. No, because he was teacher.
A three-piece suit.
Absolutely, three-piece suit and a clock, this kind of clock.
A watch in his pocket.
Yeah, watch in his pocket. And he was killed by accident. After several years, this group of terrorists was arrested, and during the process they was asked, but why you killed this person? We thought that he is communist. And after several years, my family was partially was deported in Siberia. So he would, if he would survive after 3 years, he would go to Gulag.
Why would the Banderites have assumed that a gentleman in a three-piece suit with a pocket watch was a communist?
Because peasants in that period had different style of clothes.
So if you were dressed like a Western gentleman, you were probably a communist as far as they were concerned.
Because it was unusual for rural area of Moldova, of Bessarabia at that time, yeah.
You also learned about the expropriations of land and goods from the Bessarabians in this Soviet period. By Brezhnev's time, of course, rule had been consolidated. Even in Western Ukraine, the Banderites had been rooted out or imprisoned by then. So this was underground education.
Yeah, it was the first school of anti-communism. My personal family background, my origins, yeah. In communist times, we used to say social origins, yeah. My ancestors was peasants and intellectuals. That's it, and that's why during Soviet period, I grew up as normal Soviet guy, but at the same time, this tension, internal tension in our family, this special feeling of my grandmother, who did not accept Soviet occupation. Never ever. She was permanently against. Permanently. And she told about it loudly in our home. That's why when I came to university, I was prepared to receive anti-communist message from Free Europe or for clandestine samizdat books.
Free Europe was Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, broadcasting from Munich in those days. Yeah. Nowadays a tool of Western global capitalism.
Yeah. In that period, it was a tool for decommunization. And when I came to university, I was prepared to talk to my colleagues, to my friends, some ideas which were really directly anti-communist. That I was under surveillance of secret services at that time.
And it's worth pointing out that here in the western fringes of the then Soviet Union, the Christian conscientious opposition to communism was trans-denominational. You are, of course, yourself Eastern Orthodox, like the majority of Moldovans and Romanians. But just north of here, in Western Ukraine, you had the Uniate Church, the Roman Catholics, more of whom were sent to the Gulag by Khrushchev and Brezhnev than any other denomination. And you also had...
Maybe not Brezhnev, maybe the Stalin period and Khrushchev periods especially.
And you also had a large number of the evangelical Baptists, whom Stalin forced into one denomination during the Second World War. They wrote a very famous, in my Christian circles anyway, very famous book of testimony called Vanya, about an 18-year-old Moldovan Soviet conscript into the Red Army called Ivan Moiseev, who was tortured in horrible ways to make him renounce his faith as late as the mid-1970s. A well-known story in the West. So all of you dissidents well, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but what proportion of the teenagers coming to university in the late 70s were of Christian background, do you think?
Not so many, because before us, other students were much more better prepared because their personal memory was fresh, very fresh to have this a real picture about Soviet invasion. Our generation grew up during Brezhnev era with this so-called stagnation, which was not so terroristic or so difficult period of time. It was a period of relaxed communism. In Romania, it was state terrorism and secret services were very strong and so on. Here in the Soviet Empire, only dissidents were persecuted. Normal people, no.
Very much the characteristic of the Brezhnev era. If you were prepared to keep your mouth shut on certain topics, like the contemporary West, then you could have a wonderful life, jet-setting and being a bureaucrat or an artist funded by the taxpayer.
Yeah, but the largest majority of population in Soviet period, in Brezhnev era or period, were totally brainwashed. They had no any feeling of foreign occupation or Soviet communism restrictions. It was for them more or less normal life. Only intellectuals like myself had this kind of thought and preoccupations.
Were you inspired by Andrei Sakharov, by Alexander Solzhenitsyn?
Of course, we discovered these names once again thanks to Free Europe and Voice of America and BBC, which were followed here in the Soviet Republic of Moldova and in Romania. And every normal family had this special radio station, to receive this wave. Yes, but when I became student, among us started to circulate some clandestine literature, Solzhenitsyn and others. And
you called it samizdat if it was underground press in the Soviet Union, and tamizdat if it was imported.
It was very funny that many of us didn't touch it, this kind of papers, because it was dangerous. And for me and many friends from Chisinau, especially, it's very interesting phenomenon, especially Russian-speaking colleagues were much more courageous than Romanian-speaking. Why? Because we used to be a rural population, so much more obedient to all kinds of regimes in comparison with Russian-speaking population. It was
which had a more industrialized and intellectual background.
Yeah, and they were able to absorb new ideas much more quicker than we.
They had a bigger mouth, we can say.
Yeah, and they were, and I had very good relations with my Russian-speaking friends during my period in university when I studied in University of Chisinau as journalist. And all people made many jokes against Brezhnev and communist system, and it was absolutely quite loudly. Only in official atmosphere during official meetings, communist meeting or komsomol or something like this, all people simulated serious attitude but Brezhnev period seems me is very similar than like today's current Western collective mentality. All people knows that it is false ideology, false dominant discourse, but anyhow everybody simulates seriousness and very a sort of obedience, and avoid any direct conflict with regime.
And you dissidents had crystallized your worldview or your experience into 3 negative commands so that you would not be simulating obedience. And the slogan was «Не верь, не бойся, не проси». Don't believe anything they tell you, don't be afraid of anything they can do to you, and don't beg for anything from them.
When I discovered this background of Soviet Empire with Gulag and deportations and expropriation and state terrorism and so on, I became so determined to fight against them. It was a personal choice because I grew in a very normal Soviet family in Chisinau city, and it wasn't necessary to have this revolt against the system to obtain the position in society. I was quite well as a young Soviet journalist, but
you were inside the bubble. You had it good, or you could have had it good if you had been prepared to toe the line.
You know, here in the Republic of Moldova under Soviet occupation, we were very special cultural terrorism because Soviets occupied this part of Romanian state. They prohibited Latin alphabet and the term Romanian. They invented so-called Moldovan language and Moldovan nation only to justify this occupation, the separation of Romanians from Republic of Moldova and Romanians from Romania.
They caused your Romanian language for the first time in its history to be written in the Cyrillic script.
Not the Cyrillic, directly Russian alphabet. It's not an old Cyrillic. And Soviet Empire, which used to be a sort of Russian Empire in communist style, tried to Russify not only Moldovans, but many Muslim nations to which they imposed Russian alphabet in Kazakhstan and other countries, Kyrgyzstan and so on. And that's why our revolt was not only against ideology of communism and Marxism and state totalitarianism, but against national oppression.
Under Brezhnev, the 3 Baltic republics, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, which had been absorbed into the Soviet Union contrary to international...
In the same year, 1940,
they never had their state religion, Lutheranism or Roman Catholicism in the case of Lithuania, threatened, and nobody dared to suggest that they should start using the Cyrillic script. Yeah, but for you Moldovans, you did have this imposed upon you.
It's about the resistance of local elites, but another aspect is that Baltic states were in some sort of vitrine, how to say it in English?
Showcase
for Soviet Empire, because before the Soviet occupation, after Pact Ribbentrop-Molotov and Soviet invasion, Baltic states used to be independent states.
And very successful modern European states.
I am talking about the difference because they kept their representatives in Western countries, in the US especially, and Bessarabian part of piece of land was part of another state, and we had any historical modern experience of independence.
You had gone straight from Turkish rule to a brief period of Romanian Union and then the Soviet rule.
That's why for Russians, probably Baltic states in their acceptance could be liberated in some geopolitical circumstances, not Bessarabia. That's why, and we can talk about national character, because Baltic states were brave nations, and the military resistance against communism was much more active than here in Moldova. But unfortunately, we can make this parenthesis, this remark after 35 years of independence. Unfortunately, Baltic states became total blind tools of Atlanticists of American empire.
We'll come back to that when you have a clash of with an Estonian lady later in Strasbourg.
Yeah.
That's for later on. Language politics, then, has always been a key issue in Romania, in your post-Soviet struggles as well as your struggles under Brezhnev and then under Gorbachev as well. The policy as it came from the Kremlin was called zbliżenie, rapprochement of nations, but as you correctly described it a moment ago, it was actually Russification.
Yeah, of course. It's this scenario of melting pot, this previous form of globalization in Soviet style was applied very effectively here in Soviet Empire.
You never had a moment of language riots. The Georgians did in 1956 and again in 78. They came out onto the streets and forced a change to the constitution because to them it was even more visceral. They have their own alphabet.
That's why in Baltic states, in Georgia and in Armenia, local languages became state languages or at least dominant languages. Here in the Republic of Moldova, Russification penetrated everywhere in state bodies. In that period of time, we used to say that more or less correct Romanian language you can find only in writer union and newspapers.
And for the audience who don't recall this period, you were obliged in the Soviet model to be part of the official taxpayer-funded writers' union with its code of conduct, not to oppose communism. Otherwise, you couldn't live as a writer.
Of course, but anyhow, these unions of writers in Moldova and in other Soviet republics became, during Perestroika period, the platform of anti-communist and nationalist movement. They were so loud and so brave in that period, and I used to be among them as a young journalist, and but it was absolutely tragic for us. I started my professional work as journalist in 1979.
And this is only because you had missed out on one of the 25 places per year that were going to join the course, and so you had to do something for a year.
I was not so brilliant in my school period of time because I was a sort of hooligan.
Is it not because the KGB had already marked your card as a Christian?
No.
Anti-communist?
Because of my lack of knowledge, sufficient, and many brave young people came from villages who were much more better prepared than myself. And but this year, between 1979 and 1980, I started to work in one newspaper for youth, Komsomol newspaper. But anyhow, it was a dissident atmosphere there. And in that year, I discovered that it exists a list of words which is prohibited, which exist officially in our language, but which is prohibited because our academy, Soviet Academy of Science of Moldova, had this very unpleasant mission to justify the existence of two different languages, Romanian and Moldovan. That's why they introduced Russian terms, artificial terms in our language, and prohibited normal pronunciation of several words. It's very funny. I can show you just two examples. For example, for English word trust, in Romanian we are pronouncing trust.
Yes.
We are writing in English, trust. In Moldovan, local language, it was obligatory like in Russian, trest.
Yes.
Trest. Or trolleybus, autobus. Trolleybus in Romania with Z, in Moldova with S, like in French.
But even such a common word as the verb they are which you in Moldova, in Romanian, inherited directly from Latin with the word sunt, S-U-N-T. The Soviets forced you to spell it sunt, and people started even pronouncing it that way.
Yeah. It was a very special social engineering, to use this modern term, social engineering process which deformed very gravely our national identity. Because when we are talking about culture, about history, about collective identity, we have to divide these two complementary but not unique process. The process of formation of one collectivity, one people, one nation, and the state. We could be Romanians here, or in Ukraine, or in Serbia, or in other parts, but we are part of Romanian culture. Not necessarily, I am not Romanian citizen, but it is not a problem to me to know that I am Romanian, ethnically and culturally. As citizenship, I am Moldovan. This is the difference. I am remaining Moldovan, loyal citizen. And I don't have any interest to serve Romanian bureaucracy. But I am Romanian as cultural identity, as collective identity, religious, cultural, linguistical, historical. We are, all of us, this area, are Romanians. It is not good or bad. It is the fact. It is an obvious reality.
Unless we go with the contemporary transgender idea, which says that you can invent or reinvent your identity as you see fit. But you've been battling that for years, and you believe firmly that as you are born, so you will go through life as your identity.
You know, you remember me now, very interesting conversation with one lady from State Department, which happened during my first period of political activity. It was in 1989 maybe, or in 1990. She came to my office, party office,
An American diplomat?
Diplomat, and American diplomat, and she told me during our discussion, you are a strange person, because for us, for Americans, she said, every new generation means a new country. So, for us, past doesn't exist. Only present to continue. And I was shocked.
It's a very telling remark.
Yeah. She was so selfish about her knowledge in ethnosociology and the collective identity. She told, why you are so strong fighter for your collective national identity? It is not so important. You are another generation.
Just reinvent yourself. Remake. So you went from being molded into Homo Sovieticus.
There is old story about optional identity. You are Georgian, but you consider yourself to be Armenian. Or you are Russian and you are considered to be German guy. It's about craziness, it's about fictional perception of reality. But it works now worse than in Soviet period, because you can change your identity. I prefer to be Russian.
And those examples you quoted are not taken at random. There are hundreds of thousands of ethnic Armenians in Georgia, and they were told you are now a Soviet Georgian. There are millions of, or were in Soviet period, millions of 18th century descendant Germans in the Volga region in Russia, and they were told you are now a Soviet Russian. So you weren't just arguing that for the sake of it.
Absolutely. It happens in all kinds of empires, which are trying to uniformize, to make a sort of uniformization and to reshape, reset collective identity of all people from this area, which is controlled by the same empire.
You quoted reset because you are one of the few who study Klaus Schwab's books, The Great Reset.
The Great Reset and the Great Narrative,
So the practical effect of this on you in Chisinau, or Kishinev as the Russians called it, in the 1980s with your young family, was that although you had been able to be educated in your native Romanian language, as well as in your Christian faith, when you had children, you found it extremely difficult, practically impossible, to get a Romanian language kindergarten for them.
Yeah, it was my first investigative journalism articles, which were published never, ever, because all newspapers refused to publish it. Before it, I didn't know about it. But when my son, who is now 39 years old, Stefan, was something like 2 years old, or young, or little, I tried to find a kindergarten in Botanica region in Chisinau city.
And this is already 1 year into Glasnost and Perestroika.
Yeah, it was in 1986, I think. It wasn't possible to find a Moldovan language kindergarten. Only Russian. And I used to work in that period as journalist in national TV station, yeah, official television, and I tried to obtain as many as possible informations. Finally, it was solved in favor of my son because my wife in that period worked for a newspaper which was newspaper of Ministry for Education. That's why it was made an exception. It was made an exception, and my son was accepted in Romanian Moldovan kindergarten in the Botanica region. In that period, I think it was only 2 or maybe 3 kindergarten.
So you make steady progress as a dissident journalist. And we've already established in the first part of this interview at some length, and this was necessary, the issues of identity politics, language and religion, which will be necessary for people to understand your life as a fighter against Moscow and the Western Empire later on. So you managed to get into university on your second go. You're moonlighting as a postman to supplement your income in that year. You get into this dissident intellectual milieu, become a nationalist. You're schooled by a Romanian nationalist teacher who's been fired from his job for teaching impalatable truths. We get into the early 80s, you're bringing up your young family. You become a literary critic upon graduation in 1985. You're basically editing the equivalent of costume dramas, as we would call them in the West, these productions of Pushkin or of your own Romanian writers for Soviet television and improving the literary quality of the scripts. By 1988, you joined the National Museum for Literature, a subsection of the Soviet Writers' Guild, Writers' Union. And on the 3rd of June that year, you become a political activist. You come out into the open. This is the year when, from Estonia right down to Armenia, the western fringe of the Soviet Union is finding its voice to come out on the streets openly with flags, Christian or secular dissident slogans. And your contribution to this wave is that in summer 88, in those heady days, you become the leader of the democratic movement in support of Perestroika.
One of the leaders, not only one leader, I wasn't president in that moment, but I organized this meeting. We were about 100 people in this room under the Writers' Union protection, because it happens in their building, and KGB guys tried to stop us, and we said, we are not communists, we are not anymore communists, and go out.
Even in East Germany, they had this understanding under Erich Honecker, you don't openly invade the Writers' Union building because we want to preserve the fiction that it's a safe place to speak. It's the controlled opposition.
Yeah.
So you use this cover.
Yeah. And we organized this committee of national movement, which was this which was had this official name of Perestroika movement, because it was allowed by the system. It was a Gorbachev official speeches, which allowed to organize so-called democratic movements in support of Perestroika, but inside of communist official discourse. Yeah, and step by step, we developed openly our anti-communist attitude. And
so you weren't allowed to call openly for the independence of Moldova in that year?
Initially not. initially it was the intention to obtain a legal status of our organization and to have the right to have our own newspaper and to have the right to practice freedom of association and freedom of assembly.
Which the Soviet Union had signed up to in 1975 as part of the Helsinki Agreement.
Officially, Brezhnev signed it.
Although there were cases when dissidents, Christian and secular, told the Soviet police, you can't beat us for free association because of the Helsinki Final Act. And the policeman said, who told you about that, before resuming the beating? So
Yeah. And it was a very important period because we started when the largest part of society was totally in Soviet style way of life. And we hooligans, we professional protesters and street fighters started our street protests and anti-communist slogans and so on. And inside of our movement, it was a split between us because old generation who used to be communists at that period of time tried to moderate us and to determine us to be more cooperative with Communist Party and with the perestroika and so on. And our young generation group was very radical, against Soviet Union, and it was visible during our public events because old generation, old style writers and famous cultural personalities and so on, professors from universities, they were among us, our colleagues, but their moderation was funny for us because time is coming to speak loudly about everything, about communist Soviet invasion in this territory, about national identity of Romanians from this region, about the intention to destroy communist system and to abandon Soviet Union.
So by talking about the language demands, the script demands, the history, the openness of history, you could gradually bring this onto the agenda under the protection of the authorities.
It wasn't under protection, but the authorities were confused because official narrative from Moscow was in consonance with our platform. That's why we used this opportunity. Our main political, could we say, revendication?
Claim.
Our main political claim in that period of time was Moldovan language, so-called Moldovan language, as official state language, and the recuperation of Latin alphabet for our language. It was a very strong fight against official authorities of Soviet Republic of Moldova. And it was very successful. During 2 years, we obtained many than 2 years, 1 year and several months. It was very successful because our street movement, our protests were so strong, so huge, that communists were determined to renounce on their intention to maintain Russian domination as cultural domination. And that's why we were able to impose to the last Soviet parliament, Supreme Soviet, a kind of Soviet parliament at the Republic of Moldova, our option, one state language, not two, and the Latin alphabet. It was a cultural revolution for us.
And you stood as a political candidate at this time, and you made an open platform, a manifesto of this language requirement?
Yeah, of course. Our political resolutions and the platform of our national movement was directly in favor of this option. And after 1 year, we had the first electoral campaign In fact, it was the second, because the first democratic elections in Soviet Empire were they started in 1988 for Soviet Supreme Soviet, a so-called, like today, European Parliament, a federation, yeah.
The chamber with hundreds of people in it.
Yeah.
Yes.
Federation which has constituencies in all Soviet republics, and we participated in this campaign, which was finished in the spring of 1989, and half of this delegation from Moldova to Moscow were our representatives, unofficially and directly, because in each constituency we had famous enough people from this writers' milieu or cultural personalities, something like this. Not directly politicians. In that period it doesn't exist and didn't exist yet. And the second experience, electoral experience, was in 1990 for Moldovan Soviet Parliament. And it was not like in Soviet period, it was allowed to have many candidates in every single constituency. And it was my personal experience when I became candidate for MP.
So for the first time, the communist candidate had to compete on the ballot paper with, in your case, Iurie, a non-communist candidate, for one seat.
Yeah. And it was very interesting experience, because this model was imposed by Moscow. So we can say now that in that moment Gorbachev regime was in favor of disappearance of his Soviet Empire.
In fact, he was having to order the East Germans, for example, who were dragging their feet, face it, guys, the game is up. At a very deep level, if we understand the work of Christopher Story, that was the nom de plume for Edward Hall, and Anatoly Golitsyn, the best KGB defector ever, we understand that this is because the Communist International was going from its third phase, which had lasted from the 1960s, into its fourth cycle, which was to mainstream itself in the West, to abandon the territorial hold on the Soviet Union and go to a global model. But perhaps you weren't quite aware of that back then.
Yeah, we was not aware in that period of time of this kind of geopolitics, high-level geopolitics. But anyhow, it was very interesting process, because I was young enough. I was something like 29 years old when I became candidate for parliament. Unfortunately, I lost the elections, but we were 9 candidates.
This is spring 1990.
Exactly.
You got into the second round in your single-seat constituency. You lost out to a collective farm boss, but you did get into the second round.
And that moment I was well known for national movement at national level, because I was very active during all street protests, and when we started to print our newspapers in Vilnius.
You had to use the Lithuanian capital to print your flyers and your first underground Samizdat newspaper.
Exactly. During 1989, we started to print our newspapers in Vilnius, and the guy who helped us in several years became Minister for Foreign Affairs. Piotras Vaitekūnas. His name is Piotras Vaitekūnas.
What else happens in the meantime? In January 1989, and again in March 1989, you get summoned to the KGB office here in Chisinau. The first time you met Mr. Nice, and the second time you met 2 Mr. Nasties.
Yeah.
Mr. Nice said, I'm sure there's been a misunderstanding, and you managed to talk your way out of it by saying, I don't know who it was at my rally who leaked details of a secret Politburo meeting. The second time, the 2 hard guys said...
No, they divided their role. Excuse me to interrupt you. They divided, this KGB officer divided, when I was invited for the second time in KGB office, they divided their role.
So one was Mr. Nice and one was Mr. Nasty.
Yeah, bad guy and good guy. And one of them who used to be colonel in that moment, and another who used to be mayor, In that moment was nice, and Colonel was very aggressive, and he menaced me, and
He threatened to harm your son, didn't he?
he said me that I am a traitor and I will be imprisoned if I will have the chance to not be killed, executed by Soviet regime because I am a traitor and a Western spy.
And that would have been firing squad because they considered that a military offense.
They said that if you will not renounce, your son will disappear. It was said directly, and I replied, I will kill you, both of you here in this office.
So
They were surprised. Iurie, do you know where you are here now? You are in KGB office. And I replaced, and do you know with whom you are talking? You are talking with a father.
This exact experience happened to my father on the corrupt island of Jersey, which is not part of the United Kingdom. I was a minor then, and they threatened him with harming his wife and son in England if he didn't go along with their corruption. And he said exactly the same as you, because he had a street fighting youth as a Scottish working class boy. And he said, go ahead with your threats and be aware that I will come back and kill you. I'm prepared to do the time.
Yeah, absolutely. It was absolutely spontaneous reaction. Not I didn't I didn't think about it before it, but I was determined to say this. And after that, many years, when by accident in Chisinau city, I met these people. They went around.
It was they who were looking over their shoulders.
Yeah. Because I used to be not so bad sportsman. Yeah, I used to practice box, and I was aggressive enough to be to have the capacity to convince them that I am ready to do it.
Also in 1989, you became the first vice president, and then a lot later, 2014, 1994, you became the president of the Popular Front, which later became, you changed the name, didn't you, the Christian Democratic People's Party.
Exactly. But in fact, I remained a key person among our colleagues because others came to parliament, became MPs in 1990, and I remained in our office as a person who managed all our political activities. Yeah, street protests, newspapers, leaflets.
The audience will understand this now. You're called the Christian Democrats, but you are necessitated to have a street fighting wing of the party. Otherwise, you would have been crushed.
Yeah, of course, to promote our position, we were determined to organize every single Sunday protest during several years.
On a different scale, in Britain and now around the world, since the COVID phenomenon, we have had a Sunday event called Stand in the Park. Personally, I believe in going to church on Sunday, but many people don't, and that was their act of dissidence. And you carried on this Sunday by Sunday rally, and you managed to get the numbers out. So when you say street fighters, people shouldn't necessarily picture thugs going out with knives and chains.
No, it was very peaceful. All our protests, it was my principle, and many times different people who were in fact police or KGB secret services persons tried to provoke artificial conflicts between us and police officers and so on, but I avoided every single time when it was possible any kind of confrontations or violence.
What key insight do you have for people in the West now who are concerned correctly that the authorities will put agent provocateur in their midst?
Provocateur? Are you talking about that period?
No, the phenomenon in general. If you are worried, as a modern Western dissident, that an agent provocateur will be in your meeting and will be calling for violence,
Yeah, it happens many times in my case. People were infiltrated inside of huge crowd, yeah. But thanks God, I was rapid and quick enough to stop any kind of provocations, and it was not so polite because I was determined to stop them without beating, but
You have to make it appear as if you are prepared to use violence.
because I was very efficient in this kind of activities, non-political, and everybody knew in that period in Chisinau it is better to be a friend of Iurie. If not, you have the problem. You can be peaceful protester but not provocator.
And so commences the decade of the 1990s. New independent Moldova is finding its feet. It's always been a majority left-wing country because of its history. So your Christian Democrats, right of centre, and more traditionalist are a minority party, but you become a leader of that faction. You have 4 terms as a member of parliament. You're twice the deputy speaker of parliament because you're the leader of a faction in parliament. You are also chairman of an investigatory committee in Parliament, which you used to establish your name as an anti-corruption investigator, combining that with your journalistic skills. So in that way, you start uncovering a lot of corruption in the nascent Republic of Moldova.
Yeah, when I became for the first time deputy chairman of parliament in 1998, I was elected as head of this special parliamentarian committee, which investigated illegal privatization and budgetary money and so on for previous governance. But some people remain in very strong position inside of our governance, in our alliance, and that's why in that period I was the enemy number 1 for all corrupt guy from state bodies. It was very spectacular period of my life and risky one, but nobody could stop me because I became efficient mainly because people from prosecutor office, from Ministry for Interior Affairs, from Chisinau airport, they offered me different papers with official secret or not secret but official papers, which confirmed the cases of huge corruption and illegal privatization, and it was absolutely fantastic. We dominated the agenda of Republic of Moldova in that period with every single week parliamentarian scandals. I was newsmaker, and many people hate me even today after so many years because I was their killer as public personalities.
During the 1990s, you also began to establish yourself as an author. You've always said that you don't consider yourself to have literary talents, literary criticism, but not literary writing. So you become a non-fiction writer, and particularly a conspiracy investigator. Your first book in 1995, published in both Romanian and Russian, I believe, was called Exit from Darkness. And you've written nearly a dozen books since then. The latest came out just this year, 2023, and is called The Fall from Capitalism to Technocracy, Notes of a Dissident Under the New World Order.
Exactly. I was very active as a journalist during all my political career. It was the same activity for me. I used to be my own speechwriter when I was a dignitary in parliament or in government.
And this is rare, of course. Most people have their speeches ghostwritten.
That's why during all my political activity and after that, many people is asking me even today to write for them speeches in parliament, not here in Moldova, in current period in Romania mainly, but in that period I published permanently my articles in 2 newspapers. First newspaper was in fact the second the country, the name of Tsara, our newspaper, which was printed in Russian and Romanian and Russian. And another one, Flux, it means flow in English. And it was investigative journalism or political journalism, yeah, like our position not only as party leader, but as national interests of Moldova in very critical situations. And I decided in 1995 to publish several key articles and essays and political analysis in the first book. And I discovered during our last Chisinau forum that I am doing the same thing now, because my last final remarks in September 2023, I thought about it after my intervention, was the same message as in 1994 when 1992 when I published my article, The Exodus, or the Exit from Darkness. It is about our Soviet past, and this message was for my colleagues, colleagues not as parliamentarians but as nationalist Christian movement. We were brave enough to confront Soviet Empire and to confront post-Soviet governance and so on, but we discovered during the way that the most important aspect of collective identity is our Christian belief. Without direct alliance with Jesus Christ, with our church, it is impossible to be an efficient politician and to serve your country. And it was my original contribution in that period of time. And I discovered that after so many years, after 30 years, my message remained the same. But now I am talking about our alternative media network, international network. Many of us are brilliant, but not so many are Christian believers.
The bookcase behind you, you call your Christ-like leadership bookcase. So you do practice what you preach there.
Yeah, it was very interesting. After I finished my political career in 2009, I founded this People's University from Moldova, and I became a teacher or a professor, in my own school for leadership. And I discovered before it many books which were written basically by Americans and British authors. And the first article, programmatic, we could say programmatic. The first article in this way of thinking and living, not only acting but living, as leader was written by an author whose name is Greenleaf. I forget his first name, Greenleaf, in early 70s. And after that, this school of thought started, especially among Protestants in America and in UK. That's why Christ-like leadership is very comfortable for any kind of leadership in our, not necessarily political, in our Christian society. Without this model, you cannot be efficient. You just are destroying by your actions your ideals, because it is a contradiction in terms. You cannot be a good nationalist, a good servant of your country, of your national interests, without this foundation of Christian practice. It is not about philosophy or ideology. It's about way of living your life to serve others. It's an opposite. It's another extremity of selfish mass democracy spectacle and leaders who are serving plutocracy.
So your high crime, which estranges you from both the East and the West, you were the darling of the West at one point because they adopted you, thinking that you would help be a battering ram against Russia. Your sin was twofold. First, to discover that Romania, and more particularly Moldova, had its own national interest, Romania as a people and Moldova as your state.
Absolutely.
And second, to discover Christ-like leadership, which is far from what the American patrons who adopted you and the EU patrons wanted to see.
Yeah, it was very funny because, you know, I was so popular among American political establishment, and not only American but European, thanks to my permanent presence on VOA and Free Europe and BBC and so on, and my political activity here in Moldova. I was visible enough to be popular and accepted and embraced by hegemon American brothers, big brother. But when I started to promote actively and in more coherent way my Christian vision, it was not so pleasant for my Western partners. I was so good for them when I fought against Soviet Empire, against communism, and against Russian expansion after Soviet period. And when I started to try to protect our national interests between this geopolitical fight, Russia versus collective West, I discovered that for Russia and even for US, I became a person not so pleasant for them, not so comfortable for them.
And you were figuratively persona non grata from that point in Washington and Brussels, and literally persona non grata until very recently in Romania, exactly. Your sister nation. You weren't able to cross the border until very recently.
Only for my public speeches, my articles, my books. That's it. I told publicly to Romanian authorities, if I am a criminal, if I committed something illegally in Romania, you have to arrest me and put me in jail. I am trying to enter in Romania and we are blocking me. Why? I have to know why. And after a long period of time, not so long, but 2 years for me, it was long enough. An excellent lawyer and very courageous man accepted to be to represent me in the court, because many, maybe 8 or 9 lawyers from Romania accepted and after that renounced. Why? Because they were menaced by regime.
This is an EU member state we're talking about, with a whole American battalion in it on the border of Ukraine. So in your writing career, perhaps the moment at which your persuasion breaks through is 2014, when you write a book called Fall from the USSR to the EU. This is almost exactly the same time as both Gorbachev and former Czech President Václav Klaus are both telling the European Parliament, and both of them got jeered and walked out on for saying it. They both said, goodness me, you seem to have recreated the Soviet Presidium and Politburo here in Brussels and Strasbourg.
Exactly. You know, this book, which was published in 2014, contains my main articles, which were written during 2 or 3 years. And my fight against LGBT ideology, the imposition in our legislation by so-called Eurocommissars and the European Parliament and so on, the insistence of Western diplomacy and politicians to impose to us anti-Christian, anti-family values were so strong, and our political class used to be so obedient, so blind, so incapable to resist, The time I was really shocked, and I fought back very, very strongly, critically, and I confronted all so-called commissioners, and I said, it is enough for us red commissioners, communist, Soviet commissioners. We don't need other commissioners from Brussels or from US. That's why I became the enemy after being during a long period of time an enemy number one for Moscow. I became an enemy number one for Washington and Brussels, and for all Western embassies which are here, based in Moldova, and which cannot communicate with me. It is prohibited. Even Romanian embassy cannot communicate with me. It is absolutely not allowed.
You have discovered that the Eastern European new member states of the EU and of NATO have a stricter line than the Western states in this regard, particularly in your capacity as a parliamentary committee chairman. You participated in dialogue with the European Parliament, a committee of it.
It was a joint committee, EU Parliament and Moldovan Parliament.
And you found that they failed to respect the parity between the two, and it was an Estonian member who was trying to order you around, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was a very funny story because I became so nervous in Brussels. I forget now her name, and it is easy to find on the internet. She was born exactly like myself in 1961. She used to be a journalist in Soviet period, but despite of myself, she used to be a correspondent of Komsomolskaya Pravda, a Soviet newspaper in Estonia.
So unlike you, she had gone the conformist.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Former communist journalist, not dissident. And now she tried to impose as a head of this joint committee on behalf of European Parliament to change our constitution and our family code, because in accordance to our constitution, family means for us traditional family.
Romania doesn't have this, but you do in Moldova.
We introduced it in 1994 not with majority. We used to be in opposition with unanimity, because I explained to the president of ruling party at that period that we cannot write this sentence. Family means the free association between partners, not between partners, between man and woman. And he asked me, Dumitru Motspanov was his name, he passed away, unfortunately. We were opponents, but he understood my message. I asked him, excuse me for this unpolite word, are you homosexual? He said, no, I am not. But why you are introducing? Because our project of draft of constitution was received from Strasbourg, from Council of Europe. And it was an European formula. The free association between partners. And our feeling, our parliamentarian group, was able to discover this trick. And we voted article by article when we adopted our constitution. And this article was introduced by unanimity, and it was a brave moment of our political recent history. And after so many years, in 2000, I think, this young lady was so arrogant, and she insisted, Iurie, you are anti-European, you are anti-liberal, you are against Western values, we have to change this. And I provoked, as usual, a huge scandal in European Parliament. It was a joint committee. We have to vote for this amendment. It was a sort of official recommendation on behalf of European Parliament to acquis communautaire, Moldovan.
The rule of EU law.
To harmonize our legislation to LGBT legislation of Western countries.
And this is years before most EU member states, even Western ones, accepted homosexual partnership. But they were still already imposing it on you by fax.
And fortunately for us, some members of European Parliament abandoned our meeting because the Republic of Moldova is not so important geopolitically, it is normal. And in this room remained only 4 members of parliament and with staffers and so on in presidium. And in this room we were 4 Moldovan members of this delegation.
But you still had a quorum to take.
Yeah, and she insisted, we have to vote for it. And I said, stop, madam. In accordance with our rules, all decisions are adopted by consensus, not by vote, majority. No, I insist we have to vote. And fortunately for us, we had 3 votes and the Europeans only 2 votes.
Because the others had walked out.
Among us was one a little bit and traditional oriented guy.
An effeminate man.
Yeah, who asked, abstentions, please. Abstentions, please. It was funny. And I said, I will tell to your party boss that you voted against. I am not against. I am just abstentions. The future ambassador to Paris. Okay. By the way, it was very serious confrontation because I discovered, it wasn't for the first time, but I discovered step by step how arrogant, how violent, how aggressive could be Europeans against us as sovereign country. They perceived ourselves as slaves, as subordinate country. That's why it was for a long period of time of fight against LGBT network. And okay, in 2009 I lost the elections, even because of my resistance against official European agenda, because dominant media, which is financed from Western foundations, killed me politically. Yeah,